Everyone remembers who entered the ark. Almost nobody asks what was left outside. That is the part of the flood story most people pass over without noticing. They picture Noah, his family, the animals, the rain, the door, and then the water. They know the safe side of the wood. They know the story from inside the vessel. But the old texts keep forcing one darker question into the room. If the ark was a boundary, then what was standing on the other side when that boundary closed? This is not just a question about animals. It is not just a question about frightened people in the rain. Genesis gives us a brief line about a world that had become corrupted and strange before the flood. Then it closes the door. It tells you who was preserved. It does not slow down to show you everything that was shut out. But the Book of Enoch walks back into that world and says the flood was also about beings that crossed a line heaven never allowed them to cross. So before we go any further, hold this picture in your mind. The ark is not just a boat. In the story, it is a dividing wall. On one side, a preserved remnant. On the other side, a whole corrupted order reaching its final hour. And if Enoch is right, the most terrifying thing outside the ark was not the weather. It was the fate of the beings whose rebellion helped make the flood necessary. That is why this title matters. The beings outside the ark are not random figures from a fantasy story. They are tied to one of the strangest traditions in ancient Jewish literature. They are tied to the Watchers, to the giants, to forbidden knowledge, to the cries of the earth, and to a judgment that Enoch says began before the water ever reached the mountains. Genesis opens the door only a little. It says that in the days before the flood, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, and that the mighty ones were in the earth. The passage is short, but it has disturbed readers for centuries. Who were these sons of God? Why does the text place them right before the flood? Why does the world collapse after their appearance? Why does the story move so quickly from strange unions to cosmic judgment? Most people hear that passage once, feel the discomfort, and move on. Enoch does not move on. Enoch stops there. Enoch takes that tiny crack in Genesis and opens it into an entire hidden courtroom. He says the beings behind that ancient crisis were watchers, heavenly beings appointed to observe, who descended, bound themselves by oath, and entered the human world in a way they were never meant to enter. The moment you understand that, the ark becomes more than a vessel. It becomes the last visible sign that heaven was separating two worlds. The preserved world inside, the corrupted world outside, the line of Noah inside, the Watcher's legacy outside, the living remnant inside, the judgment of the old order outside. And this is where the story becomes much bigger than a flood, because the Book of Enoch does not describe the flood as random destruction. It describes it as a response to beings who abandoned their appointed place, a response to forbidden teachings spreading through the earth, a response to violence that in the text rises upward like a complaint. The earth itself is pictured as crying out under the weight of what has happened. That is the atmosphere behind the ark door. Not a children's story, not just rain, not just a man building a boat while neighbors laughed, a cosmic legal boundary. And on the other side of that boundary were beings whose fate was already being written. The first thing Enoch gives us is the descent. The Watchers look down. They desire what belongs to the human world. They speak among themselves. They know they are crossing a line. This is important because the story does not present them as confused animals or mindless forces. It presents them as responsible beings. They understand enough to make an oath. They understand enough to fear blame. They understand enough to bind themselves together so that none of them carries the guilt alone. That detail matters for retention because it changes the emotional center. The most frightening beings in the story are not frightening because they are ugly. They are frightening because they know. They know the boundary. They know the law. They know the place they are leaving, and they still descend. This is why the word beings is stronger for this channel than simply saying creatures. Creatures sounds like something crawling out of a myth. Beings suggests something with will, rank, knowledge, and responsibility. That is exactly what Enoch is describing. The Watchers are not beasts. They are watchers. They are supposed to see. They are supposed to guard. They are supposed to remain in their appointed order. But in the story, the ones assigned to watch become the ones who violate what they were watching. Now bring that back to the ark. When the door begins to close, the visible drama is water rising around wood, but the invisible drama is older. The world outside is not merely unlucky. It is a world that has been changed by unlawful contact between heaven and earth. That is why the question of who remained outside is not only a survival question, it is a judgment question. The Book of Enoch says the Watchers taught things humanity was not ready to carry: adornment, enchantments, heavenly signs, roots, metals, and secret arts. The point is consistent. Knowledge came down without wisdom. Power came down without obedience. Ability came down without holiness, and the human world became swollen, but hollowed out in soul. That is a pattern modern people understand without needing to believe the text literally. Even a secular viewer understands the danger of knowledge arriving faster than conscience. Tools appear, power spreads. People learn how to shape the world before they learn how to rule themselves. Enoch expresses that ancient fear in the language of heaven and earth. It says the crisis before the flood was not ignorance, it was corrupted knowledge. That is why the flood in Enoch feels like an answer to a contaminated system. The ark preserves a line, the water removes an order, the door marks the separation, and the beings outside the ark are not merely standing in rain. They are standing inside the consequence of what they started. But Enoch adds another layer. The watchers themselves are not simply washed away. Their fate is different. In the story, the heavenly messengers are told to bind them, imprison them, and hold them for judgment. That is the part most people never hear in Sunday school. The flood ends one age, but it does not end the judgment of the beings who helped corrupt that age. Their fate continues beyond the rain. So if you clicked this because you wondered what the Book of Enoch says happened to the beings outside the ark, here is the answer in its simplest form. The human world outside the ark was swallowed by the flood. The giant legacy of the Watchers was cut down, but the Watchers themselves were bound, removed from ordinary life, and held under judgment. Enoch does not let the story end with water. It turns the flood into the first visible act of a longer divine sentence. And now you can feel why the ark door is such a powerful image. It is not only protection, it is exclusion. It is not only mercy, it is separation. It is not only a doorway closing against water, it is a doorway closing against an entire broken order. Most flood retellings place the viewer inside the ark with Noah. That is safe, that is familiar, that is the version painted on nursery walls. But this story forces you outside the ark for one moment. It makes you stand in the rain with the world that is not being preserved. It makes you look at the door from the other side. And from that side, the flood is not a weather event. It is a verdict. Subscribe to the Buried Testament if you want the old buried texts read without the soft filter. Because this channel is not about adding fantasy to scripture. It is about showing the ancient material that gathered around the passages most people were taught to skip. Now listen closely, because the next part is where the title becomes even sharper. The Book of Enoch is not just interested in what happened before the flood. It is interested in why the flood did not erase the memory of the beings. That is strange. If the world was cleansed, why did later generations still tell stories about watchers, giants, spirits, imprisoned rebels, and forbidden knowledge? Why did the memory survive? Why did Jewish and Christian writers keep circling back to angels who sinned, beings held in chains, and ancient judgment? The answer is that the flood, in this tradition, removes the visible outbreak but leaves a warning written into the structure of the world. The story is meant to teach that not every boundary can be crossed safely. Heaven and earth can meet when heaven sends. But when beings abandon their place and seize what was not given, the result is not enlightenment, it is collapse. That is the buried lesson behind the ark. The ark is not just a rescue machine, it is a witness that creation has borders. There is a border between obedience and corruption. There is a border between revealed wisdom and stolen knowledge. There is a border between heaven descending in mercy and beings descending in rebellion. There is a border between the remnant inside and the world outside. When that door closes, all those borders become visible at once. That is the emotional power of the story. It says the beings outside the ark were not merely below humanity. Some were above humanity and still fell beneath judgment. That reversal is what makes Enoch so unsettling. The flood does not simply punish the weak. It judges the powerful. It judges the teachers. It judges the beings who thought their rank made them untouchable. And it preserves the man who obeyed. That contrast is the spine of the whole video. Noah survives not because he controls heaven, but because he obeys the word given to him. The Watchers fall not because they lack power, but because they violate the order given to them. One man enters wood and lives. Mighty beings cross heaven and earth and are bound. That is the upside-down logic of the ancient story. The humble man is hidden in a box. The exalted beings are dragged into confinement. The ark floats. The Watchers sink into judgment. And Enoch says the universe noticed. Now let us go deeper into the beings themselves. In Enoch, the Watchers are named. That is important. Names make the story feel like a record instead of a fog. The text does not say vaguely that something strange happened. It gives leaders. It gives roles. It gives responsibility. It says the corruption came through decisions, teachings, and oaths. That is why this tradition kept its hold on ancient imagination. It did not feel like a myth about random chaos. It felt like a case file, and that case file has a structure. First, the beings descend. Then, they unite with the human world. Then, violence and corruption fill the earth. Then, the cry rises. Then, judgment is announced. Then, the flood comes. Then, the guilty beings are bound. That sequence is the hidden skeleton behind the Ark story in Enochic tradition. And when you place that skeleton beside Genesis, the flood suddenly looks less simple. Genesis gives you the compressed version. Enoch gives you the expanded ancient imagination around the same wound. Genesis says the world was filled with violence. Enoch asks where that violence came from, who taught it, who benefited from it, and who paid for it. This does not mean you need to treat Enoch as equal to every Bible tradition. Different communities received it differently. The Ethiopian Christian tradition preserved it with special honor. Aramaic fragments connected to Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, showing that parts of this tradition were alive in ancient Jewish circles. Many Western churches did not place the whole book inside their canon. That is why it is so fascinating. Preserved, debated, echoed, and never completely forgotten. That edge is where the buried testament lives. Not making fake claims, not pretending every hidden text was erased by one villain, not saying every manuscript has the same authority everywhere, but reading the old material carefully enough to see what questions it preserves. And this question is enormous. If the Ark saved the remnant, what happened to the beings outside? Enoch answers that some were swallowed by the judgment they helped bring. Some were removed from the world and bound. Some left behind a memory that later texts would describe as a warning against beings who abandoned their proper dwelling. The old world ended, but the meaning of that ending remained. That is why later readers kept seeing the flood as more than water. It became a sign of cosmic discipline, a sign that heaven does not ignore corrupted power forever, a sign that beings can be ancient and still accountable, a sign that knowledge can be impressive and still forbidden, a sign that a closed door can be mercy for one side and judgment for the other. Now imagine the final night before the rain becomes undeniable. The Ark stands like a dark wall of wood against a sky breaking open. The animals are inside. The family of Noah is inside. The last supplies are inside. The door is not just carpentry. It is the last line between worlds. Outside, the old age still thinks it is real. Outside, the powerful still remember their strength. Outside, the teachings of the Watchers still mark the human world. Outside, the beings connected to that rebellion still face what is coming. Then the door closes, not loudly in the text, not with a speech, not with a debate, just closed. That silence may be the most frightening part. Because judgment in these ancient stories does not always arrive with explanation at the final second. The explanation has already been given. The warning has already been given. The building of the Ark itself has already been the sign. By the time the door closes, the world is not being asked to understand. It is being separated. That is why the first minute of this video had to begin with the door. The door is the proof object. You can see it. You can understand it. You do not need a theological degree. A child understands a closed door. An atheist understands a closed door. A believer understands a closed door. The question is what kind of door it is. In this story, it is the door between preservation and fate. And the Book of Enoch says the fate outside was not random, it was assigned. The Watchers who descended were not allowed to simply vanish into legend. They were named, judged, and bound. Their children, the mighty ones who filled the earth with terror in the tradition, became part of the reason the old world could not continue. Their knowledge did not save them. Their height did not save them. Their ancient power did not save them. The water rose and the court above them had already spoken. That is the part that makes the story hit a modern viewer. We live in a world that worships power, access, and hidden knowledge. Enoch says hidden knowledge can destroy you if it comes through rebellion. We live in a world that assumes being above others means escaping accountability. Enoch says the beings above humanity were judged more severely because they knew more. We live in a world that treats boundaries as obstacles. Enoch says some boundaries are the mercy of creation. So the beings outside the Ark are not only ancient figures, they are a warning about a certain kind of arrogance. The arrogance that says rank can overrule law. The arrogance that says knowledge can replace obedience. The arrogance that says desire can cross any border and rename the crossing wisdom. The flood says no. The Ark says no. The closed door says no. And Enoch says the beings heard that no too late. Now I want you to notice one more detail. Noah is not the main explainer of this tradition. Enoch is. That is strange because Noah is the man in the flood story. Noah builds the Ark. Noah enters the Ark. Noah survives the flood. But Enoch is the one who becomes the messenger to the Watchers. Enoch is the one who carries the sentence. Enoch is the one who moves between worlds as a scribe, witness, and interpreter. That makes the Book of Enoch feel like a buried prequel to the flood. It says that before Noah entered the ark, another righteous figure had already seen the heavenly case against the beings who corrupted the earth. Enoch stands before the flood like a witness before the verdict. Noah stands inside the ark like a remnant after the verdict. One witnesses, one survives. Both belong to the same judgment. That is why the tiny scribe in the thumbnail matters. He is small because the scene is huge. He holds the lantern because the viewer needs a witness. He points upward because the meaning of the flood is not found only in the water below. It is found in the court above. And once you see the flood that way, the old story changes shape. The rain is not the center. The center is accountability. The ark is not the center. The center is separation. Noah is not the only question. The question is what kind of world had to be left behind for a new world to begin. That is why the title does not say animals outside the ark. That is too small. It says the beings outside the ark. That word opens the higher layer, the unseen layer, the layer Enoch spends so much time exposing. And it also protects the story from a cheap reading. We are not saying Noah looked through the rain and personally identified every being at the exact second the door closed. That would be sloppy. We are saying the ancient Enochic tradition explains the fate of the beings connected to the flood world outside the ark. That is the honest version. And the honest version is still strong enough to click. Sometimes the truthful version is stronger because it gives the viewer trust. If the title screams too much, the viewer may click once and never return. If the title opens a real ancient door and the video pays it, the viewer stays. That is the difference between cheap mystery and buried testament. Now look at how the story pays off. The beings outside the ark had three kinds of fate in the Enochic imagination. First, the corrupted human world that had joined their violence was removed by the flood. Second, the giant offspring tradition was cut down and became a lingering terror in memory. Third, the watchers themselves were bound for judgment because their guilt was not washed away by water. It was held. That is a layered fate. It gives the video depth. The flood handles the world. The heavenly sentence handles the watchers. The memory handles the viewer. Because the real purpose of the story is not only to tell you that ancient beings were judged, it is to ask whether you understand why. They were not judged for being mysterious. They were judged for crossing. They were not judged for having knowledge. They were judged for corrupting knowledge. They were not judged because heaven feared their power. They were judged because power severed from obedience becomes ruin. That is the moral weight behind Enoch. That is what separates this from ordinary flood content. The buried question is different. What spiritual crime made the flood the answer? What beings stood behind the crisis? What did Enoch say happened to them after the door closed? If this is the first time you have heard the flood connected to the watchers, write beings in the comments. Not because comments are decoration, but because that word is the line we are tracing. Beings who watched, beings who crossed, beings who taught, beings who were judged. That one word is the key to why this version of the flood feels so different. Now let us connect this to the wider biblical memory without overclaiming. Later texts speak about heavenly beings who sinned, who did not keep their proper place and who are kept for judgment. Those echoes matter. They show that the idea of ancient rebellious beings under judgment was not isolated to one forgotten corner. It moved through the imagination of early Jewish and Christian readers. Whether a community placed Enoch in its Bible or not, the atmosphere of Enochic thought was known. That is why the story did not disappear, because the question did not disappear. What happens when beings above the human world corrupt the human world? What happens when heaven is imitated without obedience? What happens when the ancient boundary is crossed? The answer in Enoch is confinement and judgment. The answer in Genesis is a flood and an ark. Put them beside each other and the picture becomes terrifyingly complete. The ark does not only save Noah, it exposes the fate of everyone and everything outside. The door closes, and the difference between hidden righteousness and public power becomes clear. The loud world outside cannot save itself. The hidden family inside cannot open the door by force. The beings who thought they could cross any boundary meet the one boundary they cannot cross. That is the moment the title is built around, before it closed. Those words matter. Not after the flood, not long after the ark landed. Before it closed. The last instant when the old world still had shape. The last instant when the door still showed a line of light. The last instant when the beings outside could be imagined looking at the boundary they had ignored for too long. That is cinematic because it is theological. The image works because the idea works. A closing door, a rising flood, a being outside, a scribe witnessing, a word burning on parchment. Everything in the thumbnail should push the same question the title asks. Who were the beings outside, and what fate did Enoch say awaited them? And the answer is not gentle. They were not invited in. They were not absorbed into the new world. They were not excused because they were ancient. They were judged according to the boundary they crossed. That is why Enoch feels dangerous. It does not flatter power. It does not make the forbidden glamorous. It says the hidden world is real enough to be accountable. It says spiritual rank does not cancel judgment. It says the old world was not destroyed because heaven lost control, but because heaven reasserted order. And if that is true, then the flood story is not only about what God saved. It is also about what God refused to carry forward. The ark carried Noah. It carried his family. It carried the creatures appointed to continue life. But it did not carry the corrupted system. It did not carry the violence. It did not carry the forbidden order. It did not carry the beings whose rebellion had no place in the world after judgment. That is the buried side of the ark. Every rescue also reveals what is not rescued. Every remnant implies an exclusion. Every covenant after the flood stands on the grave of an old age. And Enoch tells you that the old age was not merely human. That is the line that changes everything. When people say flood story, they usually think of water. When Enoch says flood story, he makes you think of beings, oaths, forbidden instruction, giant violence, angelic judgment, imprisonment, and a cosmic court answering the cry of the earth. That is why this story still pulls viewers, because it takes the most familiar story in the Bible and reveals the shadow underneath it. Noah is familiar. The ark is familiar. The rain is familiar. But the beings outside the ark are not familiar. That gap is the click. That gap is the retention. That gap is why the Book of Enoch keeps returning to the feed even when people say they have heard everything. They have not. They have heard the ark from the inside. They have not stood outside the door. So let the final image stay with you. A wall of ancient wood, a line of gold light, rain turning the ground to black water, a figure outside whose face still remembers heaven, a small scribe holding a lamp, a word burning on parchment, the door closing. That is the buried testament of the flood. Not only that Noah was saved, but that some beings were left outside because heaven had already judged what they brought into the world. And if the old text is right, the most frightening thing about the flood is not how high the water rose. It is how late the guilty understood the meaning of the door. Subscribe to the Buried Testament, because the next buried text does the same thing to another familiar story. It takes a verse people think they understand and opens the hidden chamber underneath it. And once you see the chamber, the old story never looks simple again.